On American TV in the middle of the noughties, you used to see this commercial. Stanford Financial Group was then a flourishing financial empire that promised investment returns that were astounding but fake.
From humble beginnings, my family has created a
In charge of this massive fraud was a Texan billionaire, Alan Stanford, seen here in his Houston offices.
I am truly honored and truly excited to lead our companies forward in the 21st century.
He was never a billionaire. That's the point, I think, because it was all a fraud. So, I mean, what he lived off was other people's money.
He stole in excess of $5 billion from investors, either for his own personal wealth or to build his empire.
In 2008, law enforcement put an end to this incredible fraud that had ruined 21,000 victims. For over 25 years, this man ran a Ponzi scheme, the same kind of scam used by the famous Bernard Madoff.
He has a unique combination of ego, narcissism, and greed that people like him and Madoff and that type of schemer or fraudster typically possess.
We have uncovered dozens of unseen videos, internal promotional films from the Stanford Bank, which show a life made up of lies, opulence, and kitsch.
Okay. The Stanford legacy began nearly 70 years ago back in Mahia, Texas, where my grandfather started.
His life was fake, his history was fake, his bank was fake.
Alan Stanford is a white-collar criminal who's never hidden away, but instead created a public image as a trustworthy banker.
From the way he dressed, to the gold pin, to the constant appearances at Washington mixers or giving money to non-profit organizations, it was all an act.
Freeing himself from laws, governments, and morals, Stanford built himself an empire that allowed him to operate in complete secrecy. It was on a small, corrupt island in the Caribbean, Antigua and Barbuda, where he acted like a quasi-dictator.
He could toss money at the administration and get his own way and dictate the policies of this twin island state of about 90,000 people.
In our investigation, from his former offices in the Caribbean to his banks in Houston and Miami, and as far as his hometown in Texas, we found key witnesses to this disgraceful story. Several former employees who were close to Alan Stanford, but also a victim, and the prosecutor who brought about his downfall. They all paint a portrait of a larger-than-life criminal with startling charisma.
It's that outsized, big ego, tall-talking Texan that it's almost like JR in the TV series Dallas, right? Those kind of figures. It's the mythical Texas asshole, liar, business person who will do anything to get ahead. And Alan Stanford was that myth. He was perfect.
This is the portrait of this Texan monster, the billionaire pirate of the Caribbean, a true symbol of the failure of the American financial system.
And this didn't run it, is it? This is off.
The story starts here, in the town of Mexia, Texas. It's a small community of 6,000 people, where Alan Stanford was born on the 24th of March, 1950. His father, James, worked in insurance and was also mayor of the town. His mother, Sammy, was a homemaker. Although the Stanford family were well known in the town, there was nothing to indicate that Alan, the young country boy, would go on to live a life of indecent opulence. 50 years later, Dave Henry became one of his close collaborators. For 10 years, he handled the audiovisual promotion of Alan Stanford's financial empire. Fascinated by the story, he's continued to research his former boss.
The video was going to be played tonight, and I normally don't get emotional or...
So, there you have it. Egomaniac, martinet, sociopath.
Look, it's me. About 30 pounds heavier.
Psychopath. That's Alan Stanford. when we left.
Mejia is a very small town in the Bible Belt, as we call it here. So typically very conservative, religious, Baptist specifically kind of people. In that environment, it looks to me like they were probably the wealthiest family in town. I went back and saw newspaper headlines, and one of the newspaper headlines was, Alan Stanford celebrates 4th birthday with 12 friends. You know, so Mom would buy the little article, or she'd call the newspaper editor.
Alan grew up a lot. He was soon over 6 foot tall. His physique was exceptional. He had an intense gaze, a deep voice, a handshake to crush your fingers, and an impressive build. In the late 1960s, he gained a degree in business here at Baylor University. Very early, the young man seemed obsessed with success.
He would tell you, I'm not just going to be rich, I'm going to be the richest person in the world, or among the richest persons in the world. So, you know, he was driven by this desire to be a billionaire.
And to make a fortune in the mid-1970s, fitness was a promising sector. Americans were won over to the trend by the muscles of the young Arnold Schwarzenegger. In Waco, Texas, Alan Stanford attended a club in the town's suburbs here in this shopping area. Full of confidence, he bought it and renamed it Total Fitness Club.
Life was pretty comfortable for Alan Stanford up until that time. I think, you know, Dad was paying for college, Dad was paying for his house, Dad paid for him to buy his first business. So he was kind of a spoiled, upper middle class kid.
Alan Stanford took a gamble, making the club exclusively male. It was an immediate success.
He was the first clubs to have these new kinds of, you know, weightlifting machines that, you know, were all chains and stuff. He was able to get those into his club. That was sort of the secret of his success.
Gary Finley was 19 years old at the time. He was looking for his first job when he was taken on as an unskilled worker at Total Fitness Club.
The first time I met him, I was actually inside vacuuming inside the fitness center, and I heard this noise. I went and looked out the window, and he was landing in a helicopter. Here's this guy walks in, he's dressed immaculate, good-looking guy, just had that confidence about himself that he could pretty much take on the world.
In a few years, Alan Stanford opened 7 ultra-luxurious gyms all over Texas. Clients snapped up annual subscriptions at $1,000 apiece.
He knew how to manage the sale from the time a person walked in the door till the time they leave. So he was a closer. He was an amazing salesman. The industry at that time was all about making money. And one of the things that Alan had, at least as far as I knew, perfected at that time, no one else was doing, was how to create a bank draft and to draft people's checking accounts.
At the age of 30, Alan Robert Stanford was a married man with a family and also a daring entrepreneur. But in 1982, intoxicated with his own success, he overstretched himself. He opened an ultra-luxurious complex in the center of Houston in the middle of the oil crisis. With the collapse of the American economy, his sports empire couldn't survive. The fall was so dramatic that young Gary Finley, then only a manager, was able to buy the club in Waco.
Alan was that true look of success. But what I found out after I took the business over was that probably his biggest problem was he was taking in money, spending money, but wasn't paying bills.
And shortly after that, maybe a year or two later, he and his wife filed personal bankruptcy too.
The fitness king had accumulated debts of $13.6 million, a crushing failure. This was the start of a dark period of his life. Alan Stanford suddenly adopted a low profile.
It was the last time I saw Alan, he was flipping hamburgers. So whenever he got out of the fitness business, the next thing I saw him do, he started a little hamburger restaurant here in town. And I mean, I literally saw him behind the counter flipping hamburgers.
The Texan was to reappear 3 years later, determined to rebuild his fortune. In 1985, during a visit to a Caribbean island, he met a European expat. During the conversation, the man gave him an idea for making lots of money without complicating his life.
He was a bit of a financial wizard, and he explained offshore banking in the Caribbean to Alan Stanford and how easy it was to set up a bank and make money. And apparently Stanford took notes right then and there on a legal pad.
In 1986, Alan Stanford arrived on the island of Montserrat in the Caribbean. An island where money laundering, tax evasion, and financial crime were almost encouraged. There were 300 banks for a population of 12,000 people. When he arrived, Alan Stanford trusted in his remarkable powers of persuasion. Larry DeMaria knew him well, and much later became his PR manager.
He's a very larger-than-life person. I think he's 6'4", big head, very bonhomie. You know, talks loud. But it wasn't an unpleasant experience to meet him. If you're asking me if he had the gift for gab, yeah, I think he had the gift for gab. You don't have to know too much about the financial markets to sound intelligent.
The jargon's not that hard at all. You read the financial press and you can understand it. It's your victims who don't know the jargon.
With his charisma, he attracted clients in the Caribbean, recruited a few employees, and opened the Guardian International Bank with a few dollars. To head it, he gathered a team with one thing in common: utter financial incompetence. There was his father, James Stanford, a former insurance agent, a lawyer, a judge, and even a car salesman. Paul Pelletier is the prosecutor who would bring down Alan Stanford 20 years later.
It was a board of directors that was made up of nobodies, people that were either related by family or by blood or by friendship to Mr. Stanford.
His father was chairman emeritus of the company. His father was still living, I think, down in Mejia, Texas, knew nothing about the company, was just like a figurehead.
Having already demonstrated his incompetence in accountancy, he was careful this time to bring in a trustworthy accountant, an old university friend, James Davis.
He reached out to his old college buddy, James Davis, in order to provide some financial credibility and to do the books and records of this bank. Mr. Davis, at least when he was introduced to the concept, believed it was going to be a legitimate bank. He soon learned that it wasn't.
Alan Stanford had decided not to burden himself with concerns over legality. He set up a massive scam to steal money from gullible investors.
The scheme from day one until it ended in 2009 was based on the concept that he was investing in equities and safe investments, like equities, for people across the world. What in reality was happening was about literally less than 20% of what they're investing would actually be invested in these safe investments.
The type of fraud was 100 years old, a Ponzi scheme named after a crook who operated in Boston in the 1920s. It was a simple but bold swindle, which involved selling so-called safe and very lucrative investments to clients. In reality, the investments were completely bogus. Stanford didn't invest the money and pocketed nearly all of it. But how did he pay people who wanted to take their money out? He simply used the money of new clients to pay the old ones.
As long as you have enough new investors to pay off old investors, then you have what could be a beautiful Ponzi scheme.
Well away from the controls of the financial authorities in their cozy Caribbean bank, Alan Stanford and James Davis simply had to publish falsified accounts to cover up their fraud.
It was a real piece of paper with a real list of investments that you could take away and you could audit it and say, yes, if these investments are here, these are the values, and you could check it out, except they never owned any of it. Everything was false. It was just a complete false list of investments which they had cleverly worked out to give you the right number on the balance sheet.
Alan Stanford quickly became rich. In 1987, his bank's books stood at nearly $15 million. But 2 years later, the authorities on the island of Montserrat suddenly tightened their banking regulations.
In approximately 1989, the Montserrat bank officials found out that Alan Stanford had filed a bankruptcy in Texas and had not reported it to them. And that was one of the reasons why he was kicked out of Montserrat in the late 80s.
Alan Stanford quickly needed to find a new location if he didn't want to see his fake bank collapse like a pyramid of sand. Fortunately for him, there was no shortage of tax havens in the Caribbean.
You know, you can see Antigua from Montserrat. So I can imagine Alan Stanford going, what am I going to do next? And looking out over the horizon, oh, there's Antigua.
Antigua and Barbuda are two West Indian islands to the north of Guadeloupe, and they gained independence in 1981. A single family ruled over the 80,000 inhabitants, the Bird family. Suspected of dabbling in arms and cocaine smuggling, the dynasty transformed this idyllic country into a refuge for criminals of all kinds.
One day I go to a lunch and I meet a man who is a fugitive from the United States. He was indicted in the United States for bank fraud, and he'd moved to Antigua. He became a citizen of Antigua, and at that time, the Antiguan government would not let anybody be extradited. So this American had moved to Antigua, and he was sitting there having lunch, living very well, eating some sort of wonderful seafood salad. The next day, who should I run into? I ran into an online gambling king who had spent some time in a U.S. federal prison. So on 2 consecutive days, you meet people who are getting in deep trouble with the U.S. law, and they're going to Antigua. So it's a small island, but there seemed to be a relatively high concentration of some white-collar criminals.
In the early 1990s, Alan Stanford, on leaving Montserrat, contacted the Bird family. Martina Johnson is a journalist in Antigua. She's investigated the banker's rise.
So when Stanford would have come here, the government would have welcomed that sort of investment because it offered the level of development that the country has always wanted and has always sought.
The Bank of Antigua at the time, in the early 1990s, was having financial problems. He was able to, because he had stolen so much money already, he was able to make loans and actually purchase the Bank of Antigua to prop up the Bank of Antigua, which was very helpful to the Bird family, who was politically in charge. He also was able to bribe appropriate politicians to get what he needed to do.
Of course, when you have the head of the organization that should have been monitoring the bank, that is part of this alleged corruption, then it is not that it went unnoticed, it was just facilitated and ignored.
Here, there was no FBI or police to bother him. Alan Stanford had found his own personal kingdom. In 1991, he built an impressive headquarters. With a lot of kitsch columns, the building is one of the most luxurious on the island. The very modest Stanford International Bank employed island residents. No one knew very much about finance, but that didn't really matter when you were working in a fake bank. Today, the offices are empty. The files of the clients who were robbed are piled high, but you can still imagine the prosperity that reigned here for over 20 years.
It was like a Hollywood set, where everything was the front of a building, but if you go and sneak a peek behind what appears to be the front of a building, there's nothing there.
With a fine set, you also need a good story. And Alan Stanford had plenty of imagination.
Okay.
He started by inventing a prestigious family history.
The Stanford legacy began nearly 70 years ago back in Mejia, Texas, where my grandfather started Stanford Insurance Company during the height of the Great Depression.
He He repeated this legend over many years in brochures, interviews, and corporate videos like this one.
But Lotus Stanford.
He may not have been a real banker, but he became a brilliant communicator.
We were founded on my grandfather's strong, simple philosophy. Build the business step by step. Building a business step by step. Hard work, clear vision, and value for clients.
His whole life story is invented. He understood that people typically are not going to believe that a man without any financial acumen from Mahia, Texas, is managing a multi-billion-dollar financial services company on his own.
With Eagle Vision, we will continue to search the world for new investment opportunities.
Alan Stanford adopted a highly symbolic logo, the Eagle of American Independence.
The eagle soars because potential truly has no boundaries.
The eagle, the eagle. He had a fetish about eagles. Every office had a huge marble eagle statue, kind of like the American eagle, you know, the aggressive, I might eat you kind of eagle. When he opened an office in Panama City, the president of Panama came to the Stanford office opening, and the gift was a huge crystal eagle.
This was the mid-1990s, and Wall Street madness had contaminated the world with dreams of wealth and investments in stocks and shares. Alan Stanford targeted a booming market, the middle classes in South America. Jamie Escalona, an advisor on new technologies, lived in Venezuela at the time. Attracted by Stanford's marketing, he invested all of his savings, $1.2 million.
The banks were very kind of nice, luxurious. They have a marble, very nice art in the banks. And the economic situations, even in Venezuela and other countries in Latin America, they weren't that stable. So we were looking for stability. We didn't have a social security system that works. We were looking for something that would give us a security for our future, to be able to retire and to pay for our children's education as well.
The internet was still in its early days, and there were few trustworthy sources of information, so Jamie Escalona wasn't suspicious, especially since the Stanford banks were offering profitable and very safe investments known as certificates of deposit, or CDs.
A unique thing about certificates of deposit, usually they tend to be long-term investments. That helps a Ponzi scheme because you don't have a lot of people withdrawing their money at the same time because people are waiting for the maturation of the certificate of deposit.
The financial advisors, they presented material that were very convincing material with the brochures and also letters of guarantees that our investments would be secure. And really, the investments weren't that higher than all the banks. They were like 1–2% higher. So we didn't see that the investments or the returns that the bank's offering, they were really out of whack. They were kind of within reason, so we felt comfortable.
Like Jamie, entire families invested between $10,000 and $1 million with unquestioning faith. These huge sums almost all ended up in the pocket of Alan Stanford. The con man boosted his communications. He spent more and more on all sorts of corporate videos and even on TV commercials broadcast on major channels like CNN. Dave Henry was his in-house video producer. He worked on more than 100 of these films.
He worked on the image stuff. You know, he didn't work on the numbers. When I saw him working, it was working on scripts, or working on brochures, or working on the next video, or working on what he was going to say when CNN interviewed him that day.
All right, ready?
We are revamping our marketing strategy. In effect, we are reinventing ourselves.
He was lying. And it's easier to tell a lie once and have it videotaped than have to tell it over and over and over in person.
Alan Stanford encouraged everyone to act for the camera. The salespeople were naturally talented. And even James Davis, his valuable accountant, was forced to appear on camera.
4 new platform funds were established.
To me, the most interesting thing that I found in my tape library, and going back and looking at the 2 characters that are Alan Stanford and Jim Davis, is we never pierced the armor of Alan Stanford. He's always this guy, confident, bold. I never saw a moment of doubt. When you go back and look at his right-hand man, Jim Davis, on tape, man, he was nervous, stuttery, had a lot of tics.
You think in terms of, did I satisfy that need versus where's the money?
Would stare off into the distance when he was done with a take as if wondering about what he just said. And that contrast only illuminates what an actor Alan Stanford was.
Our business has expanded at such a rate that we now occupy...
Alan Stanford, the actor, when he wasn't playing the banker for the camera or falsifying the accounts, dedicated himself to what he did best, spending his investors' money. Personifying the famous American saying, he became larger than life.
He would often buy real estate, buy planes, and buy boats. He bought a mansion in Miami, which was a castle.
The house in St. Croix I've seen, it's amazing. It sits up on a hill overlooking one of the harbors. It was a superstar house, really cool.
In these rare videos, filmed by American law enforcement after his arrest, we see the Texan's unimaginable lifestyle. This house comprises dozens of rooms. A meeting room suitable for a spy movie with a retractable screen. A gym. And a collection of clothes, shoes, and beer. On the island of St. Croix, Alan Stanford owned 6 other properties and even a shopping mall. In Texas and Florida, he owned more houses and luxury apartments. But he spent most of his time at sea, aboard his Sea Eagle.
Alan Stanford had a very nice yacht, but he wanted it to be 10 foot longer. So rather than just buy a yacht that's 10 foot longer, he actually had this yacht expanded 10 or 12 feet longer, which cost more than $100 million to expand. He had 7 airplanes that he bought. So he bought whatever toys he needed at the time, and he had a full-service group of pilots, servants, and people around him that he was paying constantly. So he led a very good lifestyle.
At the turn of the century, Alan Stanford was an immensely wealthy criminal who'd never been bothered by the American authorities. At Fort Worth, in the Texas offices of the Securities and Exchange Commission, the American financial watchdog, Alan Stanford had been suspected of financial fraud since 1997. 2 reports highlighting his activities had already been produced, and yet in spite of repeated requests by investigators, those in charge refused to open an investigation.
There was an individual in Fort Worth who was in charge of the Fort Worth, Texas SEC Enforcement Division. His name was Spencer Barish. As soon as he left the SEC, Alan Stanford tried to hire him. We do know on one occasion, without the permission of the SEC and behind the back of the SEC, he actually met and provided services for Alan Stanford in exchange for money. Certainly, it lends suspicion to the reasons he may have rejected the exam division's request for action by the enforcement division.
Larry de Maria, who is a trader and a Wall Street journalist, says this kind of murky relationship was common.
You're making $100,000 a year for the SEC, and then you're investigating somebody who will pay you $250,000 a year? Well, what are you going to do? It's happened all the time.
The laxity allowed the fraud to grow to a colossal scale. Between 2000 and 2001, Stanford International Bank announced record growth of 44%, and for the first time in its history, turnover of more than $1 billion.
It was by then a multi-billion-dollar company that was all over the newspapers in New York and was making inroads not only in the Caribbean, but in New York, London, Zurich, and elsewhere across the world.
Wealth no longer seems to be the only goal of the Texan monster. In these videos, he displays more and more signs of excessive ego.
I've accomplished something that very few people have accomplished in their lifetime. Making money anymore is not my driving thing. Doing something that I enjoy and a change and ultimately is something that I feel real good about. That's what's driving me.
Alan Stanford's personality gradually became unfathomable. Was he an exceptional mythomaniac or really schizophrenic?
He believed things about himself which were patently untrue. Maybe he came to believe that he was related to the founder of Stanford University. Maybe he came to believe that he was a genius with money. Maybe he came to believe he was aristocracy. I personally think he came to believe his own myth, that it was an act, but he came to believe his own act.
On the island of Antigua, Stanford, full of his own importance, made himself a small kingdom for his glory. As you arrived at the airport, everything belonged to him, starting with the airline. As you went up the avenue, you saw his bank. Then the Sticky Wicket, a restaurant. Several financial institutions. A fine dining restaurant. And even an observatory to admire his domain.
He had so many businesses. He was the second highest employer in Antigua after the government. It was Stanford, 900 plus workers.
None of those made money. They all lost money. And the airline, I think, cost the investors about $300 million before he shut it down again.
He owned property, but he also wanted to own minds. He created his own propaganda tool, the Antigua Sun. Every week, sycophantic articles were published in praise of Stanford, Antigua, and the government. In these editions, dating from 2006, dozens of pages were devoted to a single event. Alan Stanford had just been knighted by the government of Antigua.
His knighthood, many Antiguans, and I don't want to say most, but many Antiguans were against it. To get our highest national award would have been a slap in the face of residents who thought that he was too pompous and he tossed money at them and he thought very little of the people who live here.
When he was knighted, he did refer to himself as Sir Alan Stanford and required or requested people to call him Sir Alan Stanford as well.
What do you call somebody who thinks big but just doesn't have enough to do it? You know, they just don't, they think bigger than they are. Egomaniacs is what you call them.
In private, Stanford also behaved like a medieval lord. A powerful sovereign who no one could resist.
He was a serial womanizer. But one time I was with him at a cocktail party. I happened to be standing in the same conversation group. And somebody said, "You look a little rough today, Alan," or Mr. Stanford. And he said, "Oh, I'm hungover. I got in early this morning. I took my jet down to Puerto Vallarta last night. I was chasing some pussy." So that was the kind of guy he was, right? Here's the CEO. He's everybody who was standing around's boss. And yet he would just tell you that he was out chasing skirt, would be a nicer way of saying that. But that just, you know, he didn't mind. It was not a secret that there were wives, past wives, girlfriends, children from many women.
When he wanted something, Stanford had no limits. In 2005, he paid $65 million to buy himself an island.
He made an island just off the shore of Antigua here, which he built a dummy house, if you like, to see how it would look, and then knocked it down with a view to building it permanently later.
This was Alan Stanford's monumental plan to transform his private island. He wanted to build a club and a marina with capacity for up to 30 yachts. In Antigua, the impression of Alan Stanford's ostentatious and opulent wealth was in strong contrast to the small wooden houses with corrugated roofs and the Caribbean island's reggae rasta atmosphere.
There were some people who saw him as an investor who had interest in the development of the country, and so he had great support from that group. And then there was this other group that thought he was just here to grab our lands. He was just here to take all the pristine properties, and this man with money, who is white, is coming to manipulate this little island. And our leaders just accepted monies to give him his way.
The local newspaper outlet even wondered whether it was the government or Alan Stanford running the country. Many had no doubt that the island had gone from being a British colony to a Stanford colony.
Alan Stanford was a massive individual in Antigua, and when I say massive, he was powerful. He was a dictator. The residents in Antigua and Barbuda protested against Stanford for a long time.
Stanford had given bread to the Antiguans, but now he was going to give them sports to ensure their silence. His greatest coup was funding the most popular sport in the Caribbean, cricket.
When Alan Stanford does something, he doesn't do it by halves. He does it to its best.
Opposite his bank, he built a magnificent stadium with a giant screen, the Stanford Cricket Ground.
Here is Alan Stanford to Sir Viv Richards.
In 2005, he brought together the best players from the Caribbean in a single team, the Superstars. He set up a professional tournament in his name, in which Caribbean teams played against the greatest nations in cricket, such as England.
It gave life to a sport that we love here in the Caribbean, cricket. And it put us on the international market because everyone, ESPN, the world was watching the Caribbean at the Stanford Cricket Ground. Antigua was his haven.
Fish, I have one thing to say. It was one hell of a game.
Away from reality, Alan Stanford started taunting Wall Street in the mid-noughties. He tried to poach workers from historic banks like Merrill Lynch or Lehman Brothers.
I am Stanford. I am Stanford.
I am Stanford.
All these traders came with their clients, potential future victims. Charles Hazlitt, formerly at Merrill Lynch, joined the Stanford Bank in 2002, attracted by the Texans' persuasive arguments.
He was aloof and distant most of the time, but if he was talking to you or trying to motivate you, he could be very motivational. He threw around a lot of money, mentioned big bonuses. I won a car. I won a $100,000 car for selling the most CDs. He delivered on that. It was a big show in front of the other employees, a round of applause for me. Kind of a little bit embarrassing, actually, for me. I didn't like to be put in that position, but I was happy to win the car.
Alan Stanford continued to gratify his need for power, even when he was rewarding his employees. At ceremonies like this one, he prolonged the suspense by lining up the finalists on stage before announcing who would win the prize.
He must have spent 10 minutes walking behind each one of them, and he tapped one on the shoulder, and of course that person thought they won the $10,000. And he'd go, Aurelio did a good job. Walked in, and he touched the woman, and he'd go all the way across, and back and forth. I compared it to like someone pulling wings off of flies. That's how horrible it was. Even people in the audience were shifting around. I've never seen a more egotistical, egomaniacal performance by a person in my life, and he finally tapped somebody. He was just getting off on making these people feel uncomfortable.
To ensure the devotion of his employees, he spent money lavishly. In New York, Stanford invited 300 financial advisors to the Intercontinental Hotel. The cost of the festivities was $1.5 million.
There was a recreation of Studio 54 disco. So they had a huge ballroom in Midtown Manhattan, decorated like Studio 54, with actors playing the famous people who hung out in Studio 54, like Andy Warhol, Elton John, Bianca Jagger. And they were going around with boxes of props, making sure you had fun. This party was over the top. But that was typical. They'd go to a city and go nuts for the weekend. New Orleans, Caracas, London.
Everybody in the office kind of, I believe, knew or had the same questions I did, but nobody would speak up. They were all making good money. It's kind of looked the other way because you're making, your annual income is probably twice what it normally would be,
In 2008, Alan Stanford was the 205th richest American according to the Forbes magazine ranking. His fortune was estimated at $2.2 billion. But the Texan giant would see the base of his pyramid gradually start to crumble. A handful of honest employees started to ask difficult questions. Charles Hazlitt was one of them. He wondered why an international bank used a tiny accounting firm that was completely unknown.
Their answer was that they had been with them for 20 years. It's a small firm, but it's very well run, that I should have no concerns. I wanted more answers, and they wouldn't give them to me. At that point, it became more like, are you family? Do you trust us? Are you part of the team? It was basically like this: either I conform to how things are, and not ask any more questions, or I resign. So I didn't want to resign right away. I said, let me think about it. And within 24 hours, I did resign.
Larry DeMaria also suspected massive fraud, but he couldn't ask questions either.
He had 4 women who worked on desks leading up to his office, and then he had a woman named Yolanda Suarez, who was his chief of staff. And it would have taken, I think, the 1st Marine Division to get through those 4 people to get into his office. I think I was in his office maybe 3 times.
Larry was eventually fired for incompetence. Alan Stanford attacked anyone who doubted him.
He sued everyone who came near him with any kind of complaint. I mean, he had 30 in-house lawyers, and he had some top outside counsel. So I don't think he thought he had anything to worry about.
But in September 2008, the noose started to tighten. The world was experiencing the worst financial crisis in history, which 2 months later brought about the very public arrest of Bernard Madoff, who ran a Ponzi scheme worth $65 billion. That warning would have worried the most determined of criminals, but not Alan Stanford, who proclaimed loud and clear that he would come out of the crisis without a blemish.
International Advisory Board meeting, but our balance sheet is strong, our liquidity is exceptional, and we are in these difficult times going to grow our business, and I think that alone...
His downfall was close, but Alan Stanford was in total denial. For years, he thought he'd gained the protection of the American political class by contributing to election campaigns. The businessman gave a total of $1.6 million to the Republican and Democrat parties. One of the beneficiaries was Barack Obama in 2008. That same year, he contributed $200,000 to the Democrats' congressional campaign. At the party's national convention, he was warmly thanked by Bill Clinton.
And I'd like to thank the Stanford Financial Group for helping to underwrite this.
In 2008, George Bush also thanked him in this official letter. Companies like yours are helping more Americans build a solid foundation for the future. Despite these connections, the con artist couldn't hold out much longer. His bank claimed to hold $8.5 billion, whereas in reality, it only had $20 million.
The only reason these guys were caught was because during the financial crisis, everybody got scared in this country. When all the mortgages were going down, people being thrown out of work, people wanted to get their money back.
And for the first time in his history, the new investments were not sufficient to cover the withdrawals.
They didn't have the money to give them back, because that's what it's a Ponzi scheme. So that's why they were caught. The government didn't catch them, the media didn't catch them. They were caught because there was other crooks brought down the financial system.
The complaints were piling up, and in February 2009, Paul Pelletier, a prosecutor in Florida, succeeded in worrying Alan Stanford. He arrested Laura Pendergast Holt, one of his close collaborators, for a minor offense in order to try to obtain information.
We attempted to interview Laura Pendergast Holt after her arrest. But that was not successful because she quickly got an attorney, and the interview was ended before we were able to examine her about the assets or the lack of assets in Stanford International Bank.
But this first arrest was to bring down the fraudster's empire like a house of cards.
That was the seminal event for obtaining the rest of the evidence that this whole enterprise was a big Ponzi scheme. James Davis saw her arrest quickly and knew that he was next, and he did not want to be arrested that way. He readily admitted that the Stanford International Bank was a Ponzi scheme from day one, and that they had been lying to investors with false accounting, false results, false reports, and they had been mishandling the investments for a long, long time, approximately 25 years.
Alan Stanford was arrested on the 17th of February 2009 in Virginia, hiding in a girlfriend's house. He was immediately sent to prison, but he didn't seem to realize what was happening and claimed he was innocent.
He went on TV a couple of times saying that this was all a big mistake, a big misunderstanding, that the investments were there, that there was hard assets, and that there was $5 billion, and that this was a big scheme by the SEC to ruin him.
At the time, Aram Roston obtained an interview with Alan Stanford, who pretended to be surprised.
He acted very heartfelt. He tried to get across that his world was now collapsing, and he tried to make it sound that he deserved pity. He implored me at one point, I remember, he said, imagine, have you ever lost somebody? Have you ever lost a loved one? Has anybody ever close to you ever died? He said, that's what it's like for me now. Because, of course, he's comparing this to losing his company and everything he owned.
All his accounts were frozen, and on the 17th of February 2009, the SEC closed all the Stanford banks and raided the offices in Houston.
Ladies and gentlemen, a federal court has put this entity under receivership.
For the investors, it was chaos.
We went to the bank, and there were a lot of people there at the bank trying to get into the building. There were hundreds of people lined up, people crying, people panicking. We're trying to get the financial advisors getting some answers. There were so many people there, it felt like being in a riot within a bank.
Meanwhile, in prison, Alan Stanford was savagely beaten up by a fellow detainee.
He got famously beaten up really, really badly in prison. It's been a rough go for Alan Stanford. I can't say I feel sorry for him, but he hasn't gotten the country club treatment that so many white-collar criminals get in this country. He's had the real penitentiary experience.
The trial started in Houston in 2012. Over 7 weeks, Alan Stanford's arguments were very, very vague, given the damning proof. He showed absolutely no humanity towards his 21,000 victims.
He was very unsympathetic. He didn't see any emotions. He didn't make any apologies to the victims, the people affected. So it's one of the things that He didn't apologize.
In May 2012, he was sentenced to 110 years in prison. His victims have so far received only 1 cent for every dollar lost. For Jamie, that corresponds to $9,000 out of the $1.2 million invested. So for the last 7 years, he's been fighting to highlight the situation through his victims group.
I try not to get sentimental. It's very kind of difficult for me to receive personal stories about people dying, people desperate, sometimes asking me for help because they don't have food or they don't have money to pay for operations. It's terrible. It's having even young people and older people dying and not being able to pay for their living expenses. It's very hard when I receive all these letters. It's telling me my husband died. He had a heart attack. He couldn't handle losing everything after 50 years working hard.
This case was important to me because we were able to put the bad people in jail, but we were never able to finish recovering their money. I left the government in 2011, and so I was never able to finish the job of recovering the money for the victims, and that, you know, still bothers me today.
Alan Stanford is now 66 years old, and he will end his life in a prison in Florida. His story is rarely in the media these days, and yet it was the second largest Ponzi scheme in history.
This is a story that hasn't been told, that's not getting enough attention because it's lived in the shadow of Bernie Madoff. And it's a real American tragedy. You know, there's so many victims, and it's put so many people in such a bad place. And the US government did a terrible job of monitoring it.
It seemed to me that the entire very sophisticated Wall Street and American systems of finance and law, and banking, had all conspired to let him happen. And so I think the Alan Stanford story is a story of the complete failure of the American financial system.
People are always looking for a better return. So when there's someone dangling that carrot, which was Alan Stanford, people bite. And I think it was a combination of those things. Ponzi schemes have been around forever. You know, they're going to still continue. And they're normally done by people that are smart, charming, and organized, and know how to do it.
True to himself, Alan Stanford is still trying to write his own myth. On his own, he's written a case review request running to 300 pages. And he's published a book written by a fellow detainee. Its subject is an innocent man who is broken by being thrown in prison.